The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana plains when Jake Morrison discovered something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. For 38 years, he had lived by a simple code: work hard, stay clean, keep your word, and never look back. He was known throughout Yellowstone County as the cowboy who could gentle the wildest horse and whose handshake was better than any contract. His withered hands told stories of honest labor, his calloused palms bore witness to decades of rope burns and fence mending. But, on this particular Tuesday in September, as Jake knelt beside his dying father's hospital bed in Billings General, clutching a manila envelope that had arrived that morning, he realized that the man he had spent his entire life trying to honor had been living the biggest lie imaginable. The DNA results trembled in his dirt-stained fingers, and the truth hit him like a freight train derailing in slow motion. Everything was about to change. The man who prided himself on being genuine, authentic, and real was about to discover that his entire identity had been built on a foundation of deception. And the worst part? The very people he had trusted most in this world were the architects of this elaborate charade. This is the story of how a simple cowboy's world turned inside out, and how sometimes the dirtiest secrets are hidden beneath the cleanest reputations. Jake Morrison had always believed that honesty was like breaking a wild stallion. It required patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, no matter how much it might buck and fight against you. This philosophy had guided him through 38 years of life on the Morrison Ranch, a sprawling piece of Montana countryside that had been in his family for 4 generations. The ranch sat nestled between rolling hills that turned golden in autumn and stretched endlessly toward the crazy mountains in the distance. It was the kind of place where a man could lose himself in the rhythm of daily chores and find peace in the simple satisfaction of a job well done. Jake had inherited more than just the land from his father, Thomas Morrison. He had inherited a reputation for integrity that opened doors throughout the state. Thomas Morrison was a legend in these parts. At 72, he still rode fence lines with the determination of a man half his age, his weathered face telling stories of countless seasons under the Montana sun. He was the kind of man other ranchers aspired to be: fair in his dealings, generous with his knowledge, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to his word. When Thomas Morrison told you something, you could take it to the bank. Jake had spent his entire life trying to live up to that standard. He woke every morning at 5:30, not because he had to, but because that's when his father had always risen. He wore the same style of worn Levi's and faded flannel shirts, not out of laziness, but because Thomas had taught him that a working man's clothes should be practical, not fashionable. He had learned to read the sky like a book, predicting weather patterns with an accuracy that sometimes surprised even the meteorologists in Billings. The ranch operated like a well-oiled machine under their joint leadership. They ran about 800 head of Black Angus cattle across their 2,000 acres, supplementing their income with quarter horse breeding and training. Jake had inherited his father's gift with horses, an almost mystical ability to understand what an animal was thinking and feeling. Local ranchers would trailer their most difficult horses to the Morrison place, knowing that Jake could work miracles with patience and understanding. Sarah Martinez had been part of Jake's life for 6 years now. She was a veterinarian who had moved to Montana from California, drawn by the wide open spaces and the promise of a simpler life. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than passionate romance. Sarah appreciated Jake's steady nature and his deep connection to the land. She often said that watching him work with a troubled horse was like watching a master craftsman create art. "You have a gift," she would tell him as they sat on the porch after long days, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. "Not just with animals, but with people. You make everyone around you want to be better." Jake had never thought of himself as particularly special. He simply tried to live according to the principles his father had instilled in him. Treat every living thing with respect. Keep your promises, even when it costs you. Work hard enough that you can sleep peacefully at night. Never ask anyone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. These values had served him well in business. The Morrison Ranch had weathered economic downturns, droughts, and market fluctuations that had forced many of their neighbors to sell out to large agricultural corporations. While other family operations struggled to compete with industrial farming methods, the Morrison place thrived because of its reputation. Buyers knew that Morrison cattle were well cared for and honestly represented. Horse owners trusted Jake's training methods because they knew he would never cut corners or use harsh techniques that might damage an animal's spirit. The local community held the Morrison family in similar regard. Thomas served on the school board and the county commission. Jake volunteered with the volunteer fire department and helped organize the annual rodeo that brought visitors from across the region. When the Henderson family lost their barn to a lightning strike 2 summers ago, it was Jake who organized the barn raising that brought 30 neighbors together to rebuild it in a single weekend. But success hadn't come without its challenges. The isolation of ranch life could be difficult, especially during the long Montana winters when the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and the closest town was 23 miles of often treacherous roads. Jake had watched friends from high school move to cities like Denver and Seattle, pursuing careers that offered more excitement and opportunity than could be found in rural Montana. He had questioned his own choices during those quiet moments when the work was done and the only sounds were wind through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle. Was he living his own life, or simply following a path that had been laid out for him by previous generations? Was his contentment genuine, or was it just a lack of imagination about what else might be possible? These doubts usually passed when morning came and there were horses to feed and fences to check. The rhythm of ranch life had a way of putting things in perspective. There was something deeply satisfying about work that produced tangible results, about being able to look across acres of well-maintained pasture and know that your efforts had made it possible. Jake's relationship with his father had always been built on mutual respect rather than emotional intimacy. They worked side by side every day, but their conversations focused primarily on practical matters: cattle prices, weather patterns, equipment maintenance. Thomas Morrison was not a man given to sharing his feelings or dwelling on the past. He had served in Vietnam but rarely spoke about his experiences there. He had been married to Jake's mother, Elizabeth, for 15 years before she died in a car accident when Jake was 12, but he seldom mentioned her except in the most general terms. This emotional reserve had shaped Jake's own approach to relationships. He was reliable and trustworthy, but he struggled to open up about his inner life. Sarah had occasionally expressed frustration with his reluctance to talk about his feelings or share his fears and dreams. She understood that it was how he had been raised, but she sometimes wondered if there were parts of himself that Jake kept hidden even from himself. The ranch itself was a testament to 4 generations of Morrison dedication and hard work. The original homestead cabin still stood near the main house, carefully maintained as a reminder of the family's humble beginnings. Jake's great-great-grandfather, William Morrison, had claimed the land in 1892, arriving with little more than determination and a small herd of cattle. Each generation had added something to the operation: more land, better facilities, improved breeding stock. The main house where Jake lived had been built by his grandfather in the 1940s, expanded by his father in the 1970s, and updated by Jake himself over the past decade. It was a comfortable, practical structure with wide porches that provided shade in summer and protection from winter winds. The interior reflected the no-nonsense sensibilities of the men who had lived there: functional furniture, family photographs, and the accumulated possessions of people who valued utility over decoration. Jake's daily routine rarely varied. He was up before dawn to check on the animals, feed the horses, and assess any overnight problems. After breakfast, he and Thomas would discuss the day's priorities and divide up the work according to their individual strengths and preferences. Jake handled most of the horse training and the more physically demanding tasks, while Thomas focused on the business side of the operation and served as an advisor when difficult decisions needed to be made. The work was hard but satisfying. Spring brought calving season, when they might be up at all hours helping with difficult births and ensuring that newborns got the care they needed to survive. Summer meant long days maintaining fences, rotating cattle between pastures, and preparing hay for winter storage. Fall brought the annual roundup and shipping of cattle to market, followed by preparations for the harsh Montana winter. Winter itself was a time of maintaining equipment, planning for the coming year, and dealing with the constant challenges of keeping animals fed and healthy in sub-zero temperatures. Through it all, Jake had never questioned the basic facts of his existence. He was a Morrison, son of Thomas and the late Elizabeth, heir to a tradition of hard work and honest dealing that stretched back 4 generations. His identity was as solid and reliable as the mountains that surrounded their valley. He knew who he was, where he came from, and what was expected of him. The first crack in this certainty came on a Tuesday morning in early September when Jake found his father collapsed in the horse barn. Thomas had always been as strong as an old oak tree, seemingly immune to the passage of time. Finding him crumpled beside a hay bale, his face gray with pain and his breathing labored, was like discovering that gravity had suddenly stopped working. The ambulance ride to Billings General Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical equipment. Jake held his father's weathered hand and listened to the paramedics discuss blood pressure readings and heart rhythms that meant nothing to him but clearly indicated something serious was happening. Thomas remained conscious but spoke very little during the 40-minute journey to the hospital. "Take care of things," was all he managed to whisper as they wheeled him into the emergency room. The next 72 hours became a nightmare of waiting rooms, medical consultations, and increasingly grave prognoses. Thomas had suffered a massive heart attack that had damaged a significant portion of his heart muscle. The cardiologist, a serious young woman who looked barely old enough to be out of medical school, explained that surgery might buy him some time but couldn't undo the fundamental damage that had been done. "How long?" Jake asked, the words feeling strange and foreign in his mouth. "It's difficult to say," the doctor replied. "Days, possibly weeks if we're fortunate." "I'm sorry." Jake called Sarah, who immediately drove to the hospital to be with him. He contacted their lawyer, their accountant, and the handful of neighbors who needed to know that Thomas Morrison was fighting for his life. But, mostly, he sat beside his father's bed and tried to process the reality that the man who had been the foundation of his entire world was slipping away. The manila envelope arrived on Thursday morning, delivered by a nervous-looking courier who seemed uncomfortable being in the sterile environment of the hospital's cardiac intensive care unit. Jake was dozing in the uncomfortable chair beside his father's bed when the nurse gently shook his shoulder and handed him the package. "Someone left this at the front desk for you," she said quietly. "They said it was important." Jake turned the envelope over in his hands, noting his name written in block letters across the front but no return address. The handwriting looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. His father lay unconscious, connected to a web of monitors and tubes that tracked every struggling heartbeat. The doctors had sedated him to ease his discomfort, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and fears about what the future might hold. He set the envelope aside and tried to focus on more immediate concerns. There were decisions to be made about Thomas's treatment, ranch responsibilities that couldn't be ignored, and phone calls that needed to be returned. Sarah had gone back to the ranch to feed the animals and handle the most urgent tasks, but Jake knew that serious decisions about the operation's future would need to be made soon, regardless of his father's condition. The envelope seemed to call to him from the small table beside the hospital bed. Several times throughout the morning, he found himself staring at it, wondering what could be so important that someone would track him down at the hospital to deliver it personally. When the afternoon shift nurse came on duty, Jake finally decided to open it, more out of boredom than genuine curiosity. Inside, he found a thick sheaf of papers topped by a letter written on expensive stationery. The letter had read Peterson and Associates, Private Investigations, with an address in Denver, Colorado. Jake read the cover letter twice before its contents began to penetrate his consciousness. "Mr. Morrison," the letter began, "I am writing to inform you that the investigation you requested regarding your biological parentage has been completed. The enclosed DNA analysis and supporting documentation provide conclusive evidence regarding the questions you raised about your family history. I understand this information may be difficult to process, and I want to assure you that our firm will maintain complete confidentiality regarding these findings as requested." Jake's hands began to shake as he read further. The letter referenced a phone conversation that had supposedly taken place 6 months earlier, in which someone claiming to be Jake Morrison had hired the detective agency to investigate discrepancies in his birth records. The investigator had apparently spent months tracking down leads and gathering evidence about Jake's true parentage. The DNA analysis was stamped with official laboratory seals and contained tables of genetic markers that meant nothing to Jake but led to a conclusion that stopped his heart cold. According to the test results, Thomas Morrison was not his biological father. Furthermore, the investigation had identified his real father as a man named Carlos Mendoza, a migrant worker who had been employed seasonally at several ranches in the area during the early 1980s. The supporting documentation told a story that turned Jake's entire understanding of his family upside down. His mother, Elizabeth, had apparently had an affair with Mendoza during the summer of 1985, while Thomas was away for an extended period dealing with his own father's illness in North Dakota. When Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant, she had convinced Thomas that the child was his, and he had never questioned the claim. Carlos Mendoza had reportedly left Montana before Jake was born, returning to his native Mexico and eventually settling in Texas, where he had raised a family of his own. According to the investigators' report, Mendoza had died 3 years earlier, never knowing that he had a son in Montana. However, he had left behind 2 daughters who were very much alive and living in San Antonio. Jake read through the documents multiple times, searching for some indication that this was all an elaborate mistake or cruel joke. But the evidence was overwhelming and professionally presented. Photographs of Carlos Mendoza showed a man whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Jake's own face. Birth records, employment histories, and witness statements painted a picture of events that had occurred 38 years ago but felt as immediate and shocking as if they had happened yesterday. The most disturbing aspect of the entire revelation was the mystery of who had requested the investigation. The detective's letter clearly indicated that someone calling himself Jake Morrison had initiated the inquiry, providing personal information and paying substantial fees for the comprehensive investigation. But Jake had no memory of making such a request and could think of no reason why he would have wanted to dig into his family's past. He studied his father's sleeping form, searching for answers in the familiar features that had shaped his own understanding of identity and belonging. Thomas Morrison looked exactly as he always had, weathered by decades of outdoor work, but dignified and solid in the way that had made him a respected figure throughout the community. Could this man have lived with such a massive deception for nearly 4 decades? Could he have raised another man's child without ever letting slip that he knew the truth? The possibility seemed to contradict everything Jake thought he knew about his father's character. Thomas Morrison was famous for his honesty and directness. He had built his reputation on the principle that a man's word was his bond and that deception was the mark of a weak character. Yet the evidence suggested that his entire relationship with Jake had been based on a lie that went to the very core of their family identity. Jake's mind raced through decades of memories, searching for clues that might have indicated something was amiss. He remembered his mother only dimly, as she had died when he was 12, but he tried to recall any conversations or behaviors that might have suggested she was harboring such a significant secret. He thought about his relationship with Thomas, wondering if there had been moments of distance or awkwardness that might now make sense in light of this revelation. But the more he considered it, the more convinced he became that there had been no obvious signs. Thomas had been a devoted father who had shared his knowledge freely and trusted Jake with increasing responsibility as he grew older. Their relationship had been built on shared work and mutual respect, exactly what one would expect from a man raising his own son to carry on the family tradition. The possibility that someone else had initiated the investigation troubled Jake almost as much as the results themselves. Who would have had access to enough personal information about him to convince the detective agency that they were acting on his behalf? Who would have had reason to want this information brought to light? And why now, when Thomas was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life? Jake looked around the hospital room, suddenly, feeling paranoid and exposed. Someone had gone to considerable effort and expense to uncover this information and ensure that it reached him at this particular moment. The timing seemed deliberately cruel, designed to maximize the emotional impact of the revelation when he was least able to process it rationally or discuss it with the people involved. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah asking about Thomas's condition and whether Jake needed her to bring him anything from home. He stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide whether to share what he had learned. Sarah had always encouraged him to be more open about his feelings and fears, but this revelation was so fundamental to his sense of identity that he wasn't sure how to even begin explaining it. The afternoon wore on with Jake sitting silently beside his father's bed, the investigation documents spread across his lap like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture he didn't want to see. The steady beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of the ventilator provided a rhythmic backdrop to his churning thoughts. Nurses came and went, checking vital signs and adjusting medications, but Jake barely noticed their presence. Around 5 o'clock, Dr. Martinez stopped by to discuss Thomas's condition. The older man's vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but there was little hope for meaningful recovery. The damage to his heart was simply too extensive for his body to compensate, especially given his age and the stress of the initial attack. "Is there anything you need to discuss with him?" the doctor asked gently. "He may have periods of consciousness where communication is possible, though they're likely to become less frequent as time goes on." Jake nodded, unable to trust his voice to remain steady. There were definitely things that needed to be discussed, but he wasn't sure he was ready to have those conversations yet. "How do you confront a dying man with evidence that his entire relationship with you has been built on a lie? How do you ask questions that might destroy his final moments of peace?" As evening approached, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He carefully folded the investigation documents and slipped them back into the manila envelope. Whatever truth these papers contained, whatever questions they raised about his identity and family history, they could wait. His father was dying, and Jake would not spend these precious final hours focused on revelations that couldn't change the love and guidance Thomas had provided throughout his life. But even as he made this decision, Jake knew that the questions would not simply disappear. Someone had wanted him to have this information, and they had chosen this moment to ensure maximum impact. When Thomas was gone and Jake was left to sort out the pieces of his shattered understanding, he would need to find out who had initiated this investigation and why they had felt compelled to destroy his family's carefully maintained facade. The night shift nurse arrived at 7, a kind woman named Helen who had been caring for cardiac patients for more than 20 years. She could see the strain and confusion in Jake's face and tried to offer what comfort she could. "Family situations can be complicated," she said quietly as she checked Thomas's 4 lines. "I've seen a lot of people in your position over the years, and I've learned that the most important thing is to focus on the love that's real, whatever else might be uncertain." Her words struck Jake with unexpected force. Whatever biological relationship might or might not exist between him and Thomas Morrison, there was no question about the reality of the bond they had built over 38 years. Thomas had chosen to be his father in every way that mattered, had invested decades in teaching him and supporting him and preparing him to carry on the family legacy. Thomas Morrison opened his eyes just after midnight on Friday, his gaze focusing slowly on Jake's face in the dim light of the hospital room. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other across the divide of machines and medicines that were keeping the older man alive. Then, Thomas smiled with an expression of such warmth and familiarity that Jake felt his careful resolve begin to crumble. "You look terrible," Thomas whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier that evening. "When's the last time you slept?" Jake managed a weak smile in return. "I'll sleep when you're better," he replied, though they both knew that recovery was not among the available options. Thomas studied his son's face with the careful attention he had always brought to evaluating livestock or assessing weather patterns. "Something's bothering you," he observed. "More than just this." He gestured weakly toward the monitors surrounding his bed. The manila envelope seemed to burn where it lay on the table beside Jake's chair. He had spent hours wrestling with whether to raise the questions it contained, ultimately deciding that honesty was too fundamental to their relationship to abandon now, regardless of the consequences. "Dad," Jake began carefully, "I received some information today that I need to ask you about." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed a subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested his father might have some idea of what was coming. "What kind of information?" Jake retrieved the envelope and pulled out the DNA analysis, holding it where Thomas could see the official laboratory letterhead. "Someone hired a private investigator to look into my biological parentage," he said quietly. "The results suggest that you might not be my biological father." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Jake to wonder if his father had lost consciousness again. But Thomas's eyes remained alert and focused, studying Jake's face with an intensity that was somehow both familiar and completely foreign. "I see," Thomas finally said. "And what do you plan to do with this information?" The question caught Jake off guard. He had expected denial, anger, or at least surprise. Instead, his father seemed to be treating the revelation as if it were a practical problem requiring a measured response. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I was hoping you could tell me if it's true." Thomas closed his eyes for a long moment, and Jake began to worry that the conversation had been too much strain for his weakened heart. But, when the older man opened them again, there was a clarity in his gaze that Jake hadn't seen since before the heart attack. "Your mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen," Thomas said slowly. "Smart, funny, full of life in a way that made everything around her seem more colorful. When she agreed to marry me, I felt like the luckiest man in Montana." Jake leaned forward, sensing that his father was about to share something that had been held in confidence for decades. "We tried for years to have children," Thomas continued. "Elizabeth wanted a family so badly that it broke my heart to see her disappointment every month when nothing happened. We went to doctors in Billings, even traveled to Denver for specialists, but they couldn't find any reason why we weren't conceiving." The steady beeping of monitors provided a rhythmic background to Thomas's words, marking time in a room where past and present were colliding with painful clarity. "The summer of 1985, my father had a stroke while I was visiting him in North Dakota," Thomas said. "I stayed for 6 weeks helping my mother care for him before he passed away. When I came home, Elizabeth seemed different. Happier, more hopeful than I'd seen her in years." Jake felt his chest tighten as his father's words confirmed the timeline suggested by the investigation. Everything was beginning to fit together in a way that made denial impossible. "About a month later, she told me she was pregnant," Thomas continued. "I was so overjoyed that I never thought to question how it had happened. We'd been trying for so long that having it finally occur felt like a miracle." "But, you figured it out eventually," Jake said, though it came out as more of a statement than a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "You were born 2 weeks earlier than the doctors predicted, but that didn't seem unusual at the time. It wasn't until you were about 3 years old that I started noticing things." "What kind of things?" "Little differences that didn't make sense if you were my biological son," Thomas explained. "Your coloring was darker than either Elizabeth's or mine. You had a different build, different facial features. And there were personality traits that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely." Jake tried to process the idea that his father had been living with this knowledge for more than 30 years, raising him with full awareness that he was likely another man's child. "Did you confront Mom about it?" "I tried, once," Thomas said. "When you were about 5. Elizabeth broke down and told me everything. About Carlos Mendoza, about the affair, about her fear that I would leave her if I learned the truth." The name Carlos Mendoza hit Jake like a physical blow. Hearing it spoken by his father made the investigation's findings feel suddenly, undeniably real. "She begged me not to pursue it," Thomas continued. "Said that you were our son regardless of biology, and that digging into the past would only hurt everyone involved. She promised it would never happen again, and she kept that promise." Jake sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions his father's words had unleashed. Anger at the deception mixed with admiration for Thomas's decision to maintain the family despite learning such devastating news. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Thomas was quiet for a long time before answering. "What would have been the point? By the time I knew for certain, you were my son in every way that mattered. You had my name, my values, my love for the land and the animals. Telling you would have served no purpose except to satisfy my own hurt feelings. But, didn't you deserve to know the truth about your own family?" "The truth," Thomas said firmly, "is that you are my son. The man who helped create you might have contributed genetic material, but I'm the one who taught you to ride, to work with horses, to understand what it means to give your word and keep it. Biology is just chemistry. Family is what you build together." Jake felt tears he hadn't expected beginning to form in his eyes. The strength and generosity of his father's response was exactly what he should have expected, but it somehow made the situation feel even more complicated rather than simpler. "Someone wanted me to know," Jake said. "The investigation was supposedly requested by me, but I never hired any private detective. Someone used my name and personal information to dig all this up and make sure it reached me while you were in the hospital." This information seemed to disturb Thomas more than anything else they had discussed. His breathing became more labored, and the monitors began beeping more urgently. "Who would do such a thing?" Thomas asked. "And why now?" Jake had been wrestling with the same questions since opening the envelope. The timing seemed deliberately cruel, designed to cause maximum disruption at a moment when the family was most vulnerable. "I've been thinking about that," Jake said. "Someone had to have access to detailed information about our family history and enough knowledge about investigative services to know how to hire a legitimate agency. It wasn't a random act. Do you have any idea who might have wanted to hurt us this way?" Jake shook his head, but even as he did, fragments of possibilities began forming in his mind. There were people in their community who might have known or suspected the truth about his parentage. There were business competitors who might benefit from damaging the Morrison family's reputation. There were old grudges and resentments that could motivate someone to wait decades for the right moment to strike. "The investigator mentioned that Carlos Mendoza had daughters," Jake said. "Maybe they learned about my existence somehow and wanted to establish contact." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, though he sounded doubtful. "But why go about it this way? Why the deception about you requesting the investigation?" The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Martinez, who had been monitoring Thomas's vital signs from the nurse's station and noticed the increased stress indicators on his charts. "I think that's enough for tonight," she said firmly but kindly. "Mr. Morrison needs rest, and these discussions can continue when he's stronger." Jake wanted to protest that there might not be time for future conversations, but he could see that the emotional strain was taking a physical toll on his father. The older man's color had deteriorated during their talk, and his breathing had become increasingly labored. "We'll figure this out together," Thomas said as Jake prepared to leave for the night. Whatever someone hoped to accomplish by stirring up the past, they underestimated the strength of what we've built together. Jake squeezed his father's hand, marveling at the calluses and scars that told the story of a lifetime spent working with his hands. Whatever genetic connection might or might not exist between them, these were the hands that had taught him everything important he knew about life. As he walked through the hospital's empty corridors toward the parking garage, Jake felt the weight of everything that had changed in the past few hours. The man lying in that hospital bed was still his father in every meaningful sense, but the foundation of his own identity had been fundamentally altered. He was no longer simply Jake Morrison, fourth-generation rancher carrying on a family tradition. He was now Jake Morrison, the product of a deception that had shaped his entire existence. The drive back to the ranch took him through the familiar landscape that had always represented stability and continuity in his life. But now even the mountains and prairies seemed different, as if the revelation about his parentage had altered his very perception of the world around him. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived home, sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. She could tell immediately that something significant had happened beyond his father's medical crisis. "What is it?" she asked simply. Jake sat down beside her and pulled the manila envelope from his jacket pocket. For the next hour, he shared everything he had learned about his biological parentage and the conversation with Thomas. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just providing the supportive presence he needed to work through his confusion. "How are you processing all this?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "Part of me feels like my entire life has been a lie. But another part of me recognizes that nothing really important has changed. Thomas is still my father, the ranch is still my home, and I'm still the same person I was yesterday morning." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Identity is complicated," she said. "We're all the product of so many different influences and experiences. Your genetics are just one piece of a much larger puzzle." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The familiar sounds of the ranch provided a backdrop of continuity that helped ground Jake in the present moment rather than getting lost in questions about the past. Thomas Morrison passed away peacefully on Sunday morning, surrounded by the steady rhythm of machines that had kept his damaged heart beating for 3 days beyond what should have been possible. Jake held his father's weathered hand as the monitors went silent, feeling the decades of shared work and quiet understanding that had defined their relationship settling into memory. The funeral drew hundreds of people from across Montana and beyond. Ranchers, veterinarians, feed store owners, and neighbors who had known Thomas as a man whose word was absolutely reliable filled the small church in town and spilled out into the parking lot. The pastor spoke about integrity and commitment, about a man who had built his life on simple principles and never wavered in living them out. Jake delivered the eulogy, standing before a crowd that represented the entire scope of his father's influence throughout the region. He spoke about Thomas's dedication to the land, his gift with animals, and his unwavering commitment to treating every person with respect and fairness. He did not mention the revelation about his own parentage, recognizing that such personal family matters had no place in a public celebration of his father's life. But, as he looked out over the assembled faces, Jake found himself wondering who among them might know more about his family's history than they had ever revealed. The investigation documents suggested that his mother's affair with Carlos Mendoza had not been conducted in complete secrecy. Someone had to have known about the relationship, and that knowledge had somehow survived for nearly 4 decades before being weaponized against the family at their most vulnerable moment. After the burial, neighbors and friends gathered at the ranch for the traditional meal that marked the end of formal mourning. Sarah had organized everything with her characteristic efficiency, working with local women to prepare enough food for the crowd and arranging tables and chairs in the large barn that had been cleared for the occasion. Jake moved through the gathering like a man walking through a dream. He accepted condolences, shared memories, and discussed the future of the ranch with people who had known the Morrison family for generations. But part of his attention remained focused on studying faces and listening to conversations for any hint that might explain how the investigation into his parentage had been initiated. It was during these conversations that Jake began to notice subtle patterns that had previously escaped his attention. Several of the older ranchers made comments about his resemblance to his mother rather than his father. A few mentioned personality traits that they said reminded them of Elizabeth's people rather than the Morrison family line. These observations, which had seemed like casual conversation before, now felt loaded with potential meaning. Margaret Henderson, an elderly woman who had been one of Elizabeth's closest friends, lingered after most of the other guests had departed. She helped Sarah with the cleanup while engaging Jake in conversation about his plans for the ranch and his memories of growing up under Thomas's guidance. "Your father was a remarkable man," she said as they folded tables and stacked chairs. "Not many people would have handled your family's situation with such grace and dignity." The comments stopped Jake cold. Margaret's tone suggested that she was referring to something more specific than general family challenges. "What do you mean by our family's situation?" he asked carefully. Margaret paused in her work, studying Jake's face with the sharp attention of someone trying to determine how much information to share. "I suppose there's no harm in talking about it now," she said finally. "Everyone involved is gone except you, and you deserve to know the truth about your own history." Jake felt his pulse quicken as he realized that Margaret might be able to provide answers to questions that had been tormenting him since receiving the investigation documents. "What truth are you referring to?" Margaret glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, then lowered her voice to a confidential tone. "About your mother's relationship with that Mexican fellow who worked for several of the ranches around here in the mid-80s. Carlos something, I believe his name was." The casual way she mentioned Carlos Mendoza's name confirmed that the affair had been known to at least some members of the community. Jake tried to keep his expression neutral while encouraging Margaret to continue. "How much did people know about their relationship?" "More than Thomas realized at the time," Margaret replied. "Elizabeth was my dearest friend, but she was also a woman who wore her emotions on her sleeve. When she fell for that young man, it was obvious to anyone who knew how to read the signs." "Did you try to talk to her about it?" Margaret nodded sadly. "Several times. I warned her that small communities don't keep secrets well, and that she was risking everything she had built with Thomas. But she was completely infatuated. Said she had never felt anything like what she experienced with Carlos." Jake tried to process the image of his mother as a woman capable of such passionate feelings. His memories of Elizabeth were limited to his childhood perceptions, and Thomas had rarely spoken about her in ways that revealed the complexity of her personality. "Did Thomas know about the affair while it was happening?" "Not at the time," Margaret said. "He was dealing with his father's illness and trusted Elizabeth completely. It wasn't until years later that he began to piece things together, and, by then, you were already such an important part of the family that it seemed pointless to destroy everything over past mistakes." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's approach. She had finished cleaning the kitchen and was ready to drive Margaret home, but Jake could tell that she had overheard enough of the discussion to understand its significance. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake said before she left, "do you have any idea who might have known enough about this situation to hire a private investigator to look into it recently?" Margaret's expression became troubled. "Is that what happened? Someone hired an investigator?" Jake briefly explained about the DNA analysis and the mysterious circumstances surrounding its commission. Margaret listened with growing concern, shaking her head at the deliberate cruelty involved in timing such a revelation to coincide with Thomas's illness. "I can think of several people who might have had pieces of the story," she said finally. "But most of them are dead now, and I can't imagine why any of the survivors would want to hurt your family this way." After Margaret left, Jake and Sarah spent the evening going through his father's papers and personal effects. The task was both emotionally difficult and practically necessary, as Jake needed to understand the full scope of his inheritance and responsibilities. They found the usual accumulation of documents that marked a life lived with careful attention to legal and financial obligations. Property deeds, insurance policies, tax records, and business correspondence painted a picture of steady prosperity built through decades of conservative management and gradual expansion. But, buried in a wooden box at the back of Thomas's bedroom closet, they found a collection of items that provided deeper insight into the family's hidden history. There were photographs of Elizabeth that Jake had never seen, showing her as a young woman with an expressive face and lively eyes that captured something of the passionate nature Margaret had described. More significantly, they found a letter dated 3 months before Jake's birth. It was written in Elizabeth's handwriting and addressed to Thomas, apparently intended to be read in the event that questions arose about Jake's parentage. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth about my relationship with Carlos Mendoza and the questions surrounding Jake's biological father. I want you to know that my love for you has never wavered, even though my actions during your absence were inexcusable." The letter went on to explain Elizabeth's emotional state during the period when Thomas was caring for his dying father. She described feeling abandoned and lonely, though she acknowledged that Thomas's absence was both necessary and temporary. When Carlos Mendoza arrived to work on fence repairs during the busy summer season, Elizabeth found herself drawn to his youth, his different cultural background, and his attentiveness to her feelings. "I know that what happened between us was wrong," the letter continued, "but I also know that it resulted in the greatest blessing of our lives. Regardless of biology, Jake is your son in every way that matters. He has your character, your values, and your love for the land that has sustained our family for generations." Elizabeth's letter concluded with a plea for understanding and forgiveness, along with her hope that the truth would remain buried forever rather than disrupting the family they had built together. "She never gave him this letter," Sarah observed after they finished reading it. "He must have found it among her things after she died." Jake felt overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions the letter revealed. His mother's guilt and fear were evident in every line, but so was her genuine love for both Thomas and the child who had resulted from her affair. The letter humanized her in a way that his childhood memories couldn't, showing her as a flawed but loving woman who had made a terrible mistake during a vulnerable moment. The next morning, Jake called the Peterson and Associates Detective Agency in Denver. He spoke with the investigator who had conducted the research, a professional-sounding woman named Janet Peterson, who confirmed the details outlined in the report but expressed surprise about Jake's apparent confusion regarding the commission. "According to our records, you contacted us by phone in March of this year," Peterson explained. "You provided detailed personal information including your social security number, birth date, and family history. You also paid our retainer fee with a cashier's check drawn on a bank in Billings. Do you have any recording of the phone conversation?" Jake asked. "We don't routinely record client calls," Peterson replied. "But I distinctly remember the conversation because you seemed very emotional about the situation. You said you had recently discovered some family documents that raised questions about your parentage, and you wanted definitive proof before confronting your father." The description of the caller's emotional state struck Jake as particularly significant. Someone had invested considerable effort in impersonating not just his identity but his presumed psychological condition. They had understood enough about family dynamics to predict how such a revelation might affect him. "Can you tell me anything else about the person who called?" Jake asked. Peterson was quiet for a moment, apparently reviewing her notes. "The caller had a slight accent," she said finally. "Not strong, but noticeable. I remember thinking at the time that it might indicate Hispanic or Latino heritage, which seemed to fit with your concerns about your mother's relationship with a Mexican worker." This detail provided Jake's first concrete lead about the identity of whoever had initiated the investigation. Someone with knowledge of the family's history and a slight Hispanic accent had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that the truth about his parentage was revealed at the worst possible moment. That afternoon, Jake drove to the county courthouse and spent several hours reviewing employment records from the 1980s. He found documentation showing that Carlos Mendoza had indeed worked for several ranches in the area during multiple summer seasons between 1983 and 1987. The records listed an address in Livingston and showed that he had been employed by the Morrison Ranch for 6 weeks during the summer of 1985, exactly the period when Thomas had been away caring for his dying father. The employment records also revealed something that hadn't been mentioned in the detective's report. Carlos Mendoza had returned to the area briefly in 1998, apparently for a family funeral. He had stayed for several days and had been seen around town by multiple witnesses, though there was no indication that he had contacted the Morrison family or learned about Jake's existence. As Jake drove home through the familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains, he found himself trying to imagine the man who might have been his biological father. The employment records described Carlos as a reliable worker with experience in fence construction and cattle handling. Witnesses from the 1980s remembered him as quiet and hardworking, someone who kept to himself but got along well with the other seasonal workers. The investigation had revealed that Carlos had eventually settled in Texas, where he had married and raised 2 daughters. His death 3 years earlier had apparently occurred after a long illness, giving him time to reflect on his life and perhaps share family stories with his children. Jake was beginning to suspect that one of those daughters might hold the key to understanding who had hired the detective agency and why they had chosen such a devastating moment to reveal the truth about his parentage. The phone call came on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral, while Jake was reviewing feed bills in the ranch office. The caller identified herself as Maria Mendoza Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, and asked if she could speak with Jake Morrison about a family matter of mutual interest. "I believe you may be my half-brother," she said without preamble. "I think it's time we talked." Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized that his suspicions about Carlos Mendoza's daughters had been correct. The woman's voice carried the slight accent that the detective had mentioned, and her directness suggested someone who had been planning this conversation for some time. "Did you hire the private investigator?" he asked, setting aside any pretense of confusion about why she might be calling. "My sister Carmen did," Maria replied. "After our father died, she became obsessed with the idea that he might have had other children. She spent months researching his work history and eventually focused on the time he spent in Montana during the 1980s. Jake gripped the phone tighter, trying to process the mixture of anger and curiosity that Maria's words provoked. "Why didn't you contact me directly instead of going through such an elaborate deception?" "Because Carmen wanted proof before reaching out," Maria explained. "She was worried that without scientific evidence, you might think we were trying to scam you or create problems for your family. She thought that if you requested the investigation yourself, you would be more likely to accept the results." "But I didn't request the investigation," Jake pointed out. "Someone impersonated me." There was a long pause before Maria responded. "That was Carmen's decision," she said quietly. "She used information she had gathered about your family to convince the detective agency that you were the client. She knew it was wrong, but she felt like it was the only way to get answers." Jake walked to the window overlooking the pasture where his father had taught him to ride more than 30 years earlier. The familiar view provided some comfort as he tried to navigate this conversation with a woman who claimed to share his biological heritage. "Where is Carmen now?" he asked. "That's part of why I'm calling," Maria said. "Carmen died in a car accident 6 weeks ago. She never got to see the results of the investigation she commissioned." I found all her research materials when I was going through her belongings, including correspondence with the detective agency. This news complicated Jake's feelings about the entire situation. It was difficult to remain angry with someone who had died before seeing the consequences of her actions, especially someone who had apparently been motivated by a desire to understand her own family history rather than to cause harm. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said sincerely. "Thank you," Maria replied. Carmen was complicated, but she wasn't malicious. She just couldn't let go of the idea that our father might have had children we didn't know about. When she found evidence suggesting that he had worked for your family's ranch during the right time period, she became convinced that you might be his son. Jake sat down heavily in the leather chair that had been his father's favorite spot for reviewing paperwork and planning the next day's work. The familiar environment helped ground him as he processed information that continued to challenge his understanding of his own identity. What kind of evidence did she find? Mostly employment records and local newspaper articles from that time period, Maria explained. But she also found something among our father's belongings that made her more certain. A photograph. What kind of photograph? A picture of our father standing next to a woman who looks remarkably like the photos of your mother that Carmen found online, Maria said. They're clearly together, and the woman appears to be pregnant. Jake felt his breath catch. Such a photograph would provide compelling evidence of the relationship between Carlos Mendoza and Elizabeth Morrison, possibly even confirming the timeline suggested by the DNA analysis. "Would you be willing to send me a copy of that photograph?" he asked. "That's actually part of why I'm calling," Maria said. "I'd like to meet you in person. To share what I know about our father and to learn more about your family. Carmen's research raised a lot of questions that only you might be able to answer." The invitation to meet in person forced Jake to confront questions about his own intentions regarding this newly revealed family connection. Did he want to pursue a relationship with these half-sisters who shared his biological heritage but none of his life experiences? Was there value in learning more about Carlos Mendoza, or would such knowledge simply complicate his grief over losing Thomas? "I need some time to think about this," Jake said finally. "Of course," Maria replied. "But I want you to know that neither Carmen nor I ever intended to hurt your family. We were just trying to understand our own history and connect with relatives we didn't know we had." After ending the phone call, Jake sat alone in the office for a long time, surrounded by the familiar smell of leather and the accumulated paperwork of generations of Morrison ranchers. Everything in this room represented continuity and tradition, the steady accumulation of knowledge and experience that had sustained the family through good times and bad. Yet now he found himself questioning whether he had any legitimate claim to this heritage. If Thomas Morrison was not his biological father, did he have the right to carry on the family name and traditions? Was he an imposter who had unknowingly benefited from a decades-long deception? Sarah found him there an hour later, staring out the window at the darkening landscape where cattle were settling in for the night under a sky brilliant with stars. "You look like a man wrestling with important decisions," she observed, settling into the chair across from his desk. Jake shared the details of his conversation with Maria Mendoza Rodriguez, including her invitation to meet and her revelation about the photograph that might provide additional evidence of the relationship between Carlos and Elizabeth. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked when he finished. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "Part of me is curious about Carlos and these half-sisters I never knew I had. But another part of me thinks that pursuing this will only cause more disruption to a life that's already been turned upside down." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the complexity of emotions and competing loyalties that Jake was trying to navigate. "Maybe the question isn't whether you should learn more about your biological father," she said finally. "Maybe the question is what you hope to gain from that knowledge." Her words helped clarify something that had been bothering Jake since receiving the initial DNA analysis. He realized that his strongest feelings about the revelation weren't curiosity about Carlos Mendoza or anger about the deception, but rather fear that discovering his true parentage somehow diminished his connection to Thomas and the Morrison family legacy. "I'm afraid that if I accept Carlos as my biological father, I'm somehow betraying Dad," Jake said. "Like I'm saying that genetics matter more than the 38 years we spent together." "But that's not what you'd be saying at all," Sarah replied. You can acknowledge biological reality without diminishing the relationship that actually shaped your life. Thomas Morrison was your father in every way that matters. Learning about Carlos doesn't change that. Over the following days, Jake found himself returning repeatedly to Sarah's observation. He began to recognize that his resistance to learning more about Carlos Mendoza wasn't really about protecting Thomas's memory, but rather about his own fear of having his identity further disrupted. The turning point came when Jake was going through more of his father's belongings and found a folder containing every school report card, every 4-H certificate, and every newspaper clipping that documented his childhood achievements. The careful preservation of these materials spoke to Thomas's pride in the man Jake had become, regardless of the genetic questions that might have haunted their relationship. At the bottom of the folder, Jake found a handwritten note in his father's careful script: "For Jake, so you'll always remember that being a good man has nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with the choices you make every day." The note was undated, but its presence among documents that Thomas had clearly intended Jake to find eventually suggested that his father had wanted to address the identity questions that might arise after his death. Even facing his own mortality, Thomas had been thinking about how to help his son navigate the truth about his parentage. That evening, Jake called Maria Mendoza Rodriguez and accepted her invitation to meet. They arranged to meet halfway, in Denver, the following weekend. Maria would bring the photographs and documents that Carmen had collected, while Jake would share what he had learned about the relationship between Carlos and Elizabeth. The drive to Denver gave Jake time to process his feelings about meeting someone who shared his biological heritage but had grown up in a completely different world. Maria had described a childhood spent moving between Texas and Mexico, shaped by different cultural traditions and economic circumstances than anything Jake had experienced. They met at a restaurant near the Denver airport, recognizing each other immediately despite having no previous contact. Maria was a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Jake's own face. Her sister Carmen, she explained, had looked even more like him, which had contributed to her certainty about their family connection. "Our father was a good man," Maria said as she shared photographs and documents across the restaurant table. "He worked hard to support his family and always sent money home to Mexico to help his parents and siblings. But he was also someone who carried sadness about choices he had made when he was young." The photographs provided a window into Carlos Mendoza's life that the detective's report had only hinted at. Jake could see something of his own facial structure in the young man who smiled back at him from pictures taken during the 1980s. But he also recognized that genetics were only one small part of what made someone who they were. "Did he ever mention anything about his time in Montana?" Jake asked. Maria nodded. "Not directly, but after he got sick, he started talking about regrets he had from his youth. He mentioned a woman named Elizabeth who he said had been the love of his life, but that circumstances had made it impossible for them to be together." The conversation continued for several hours, with Maria sharing stories about Carlos's later life and Jake describing the ranch and the community where his biological father had worked briefly during the 1980s. They discovered that they shared certain personality traits and interests, but they also recognized the vast differences in their life experiences and cultural backgrounds. Most significantly, Maria shared the photograph that had convinced Carmen of Jake's parentage. It showed Carlos and Elizabeth together in what appeared to be an intimate moment, with Elizabeth clearly pregnant and glowing with happiness. The image captured something of the passionate connection that Margaret Henderson had described, showing Jake's mother as a woman capable of deep emotional feeling. "Carmen wanted me to ask you something," Maria said as their meeting drew to a close. "She wondered if you would consider visiting our father's grave in Texas. She thought it might help you understand more about where you came from." Jake looked at the photographs spread across the table, trying to imagine traveling to Texas to pay respects to a man who had contributed to his existence but had never been part of his life. The idea felt both compelling and somehow disloyal to Thomas's memory. "I need more time to think about that," he said finally. "I understand," Maria replied. "But I want you to know that you have family in Texas who would welcome the chance to know you better. Not because we want to change anything about your life, but because we'd like to understand more about our father's story." The drive back to Montana gave Jake time to process everything he had learned during his meeting with Maria. She had provided him with a more complete picture of Carlos Mendoza as a person, showing him to be someone who had carried the weight of his brief relationship with Elizabeth for the rest of his life. But, the conversation had also confirmed something that Jake had been gradually coming to understand since receiving the initial DNA analysis. Knowing about his biological heritage didn't fundamentally change who he was or diminish the relationship he had built with Thomas Morrison. If anything, it helped him appreciate the strength of character that had enabled Thomas to raise another man's child with such complete love and dedication. When Jake arrived home, he found Sarah waiting with a pot of coffee and the patient attention that had sustained him through the most difficult period of his life. He shared the details of his meeting with Maria and showed her the photographs that provided visual evidence of the relationship between Carlos and Elizabeth. "How do you feel about everything now?" Sarah asked. Jake considered the question carefully, recognizing that his feelings had evolved considerably since the first devastating shock of learning about his parentage. "Grateful," he said finally. "Grateful to Thomas for loving me regardless of biology. Grateful to Carlos for contributing to my existence, even though he never knew about it. And grateful to understand more about the complex people who shaped my life, even when their actions were complicated and imperfect." Over the following months, Jake began corresponding regularly with Maria Mendoza Rodriguez, gradually building a relationship with this half-sister who shared his genetic heritage but brought completely different perspectives and experiences to their conversations. He learned more about Mexican culture and traditions, while sharing stories about ranch life and Montana's agricultural community. Eventually, Jake did travel to Texas to visit Carlos Mendoza's grave. It was a simple marker in a cemetery outside San Antonio, surrounded by other graves bearing Spanish names and decorated with flowers and religious symbols that reflected the strong Catholic faith of the local community. Standing beside the grave, Jake didn't feel the profound emotional connection that he had half expected. Carlos Mendoza remained a stranger whose genetic contribution had shaped his physical appearance but whose absence had allowed Thomas Morrison to become his true father in every meaningful sense. But the visit did provide a sense of completion, a recognition that understanding his full heritage didn't require choosing between different versions of his identity. He could acknowledge Carlos Mendoza's role in his existence while remaining completely committed to the values and traditions that Thomas Morrison had instilled in him. The ranch continued to operate successfully under Jake's management, sustained by the same principles of hard work and honest dealing that had guided the Morrison family for 4 generations. Jake found that knowing about his biological heritage actually strengthened his connection to the land and the community, as he recognized that his commitment to these values was a choice rather than simply an accident of birth. Sarah became pregnant that fall, and she and Jake spent evenings planning for a child who would carry on the Morrison name and traditions regardless of the complex genetic heritage that had shaped their family's history. They agreed that honesty would be fundamental to raising their child, but they also understood that love and commitment mattered more than bloodlines. The identity crisis that had begun with a manila envelope delivered to a hospital room gradually resolved into a deeper understanding of what family actually meant. Jake Morrison remained exactly who he had always been, a man shaped by the values and experiences that Thomas Morrison had provided, carrying forward a tradition of integrity that would continue long after the questions about his parentage had faded into family history.